Hey gang, and welcome to another exciting episode of Zoology Online. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take just a moment, we're going to run through some of the major concepts for evolution and how it would apply to our zoology class. So generally speaking, in Bio 2, you would cover evolution in much greater detail. This is kind of just a review of that. So if you didn't take Bio 2, you may want to go back through and try to find some good videos and look over some of the concepts in evolution, because that way you'll be caught up with us whenever we start talking about these topics in a little bit more detail in class. So to get us started, the major thing you need to know about evolution is that evolution is the change in your genetics, the change in the heritable traits from one generation to the next within a population. It's really important to note that in evolution, individuals do not evolve, because again, it's the change in genetics that it denotes evolution. We don't want our genetics to change once we're born. Once the sperm and egg fuse together to form us, our genetics are set. If our genetics change during our lifetime for an individual, then that's basically going to be a mutation, and you're probably going to get cancer and die. So we don't want that to happen. But whenever we reproduce, we actually go through and change up the genes. And also, during some types of reproduction, like for asexual organisms, mutation is the major way in which they go through and change their genetics between the different generations. So mutations happen at a predictable rate. Some can be lethal, some non-lethal, and it also can not just a change in the genes, but a change in the number of genes, number of chromosomes. All of that adds to a change in the genetics, and when that occurs between generations, then we have evolution. For things that reproduce sexually, not only do we have mutations, but also we have crossing over that occurs in meiosis. We have endopotent assortment, and we also have the process of fertilization, which further mixes up the genes a little bit. All of that leads to individuals, babies that are being born, that are different from each other. You're not a copy of your mom and dad, and you're not identical to your brothers and sisters, unless of course you're identical twins, which is a different scenario. But for the most part, all babies that are born have slightly different genes. They're still the same species, they're still related to each other, but they don't look exactly the same. But those small differences, it's not just looks, it could be other features like physiology, anatomy, it could be things like mental processing power. There's a whole bunch of different traits in all organisms that are affected by this. But each individual that's born has a different survival chance because they're all slightly genetically different. Nature comes in and says which variations work in a particular environment, and it removes the ones that don't work, and it promotes the ones that do work well in that environment. Now, if the environment were to change, a trait that's not so good before may become better adapted later on. Not later on, but maybe better adapted for that new environment. So there's a lot of different variations and variables that go into guiding the process of evolution. This is all covered a lot more in detail in my Bio 2 class. Again, if you need more information about it, you can always do a little research yourself. So again, people do not evolve, populations evolve. The three major focuses that we would cover in evolution would be macroevolution, microevolution, and gene flow. Now, for the purposes of the zoology class, we really only look at the macroevolution, the big long-term changes that are caused in species because of evolution. For example, how a land animal evolved into the modern day whale. That took millions and millions of years, hundreds of millions of generations. That is a long-term effect, and that's generally what we cover in zoology when we look at the evolution from one phylogenetic species to another phylum. But also there's microevolution, which is the looking at the change from genetics from one generation to the other. In other words, so a certain percent of people in this generation have blue eyes. When they reproduce, what's the percent of blue eyes in the next generation? They're not always going to be the same. That's just a small example. But like from this mother cat to her kittens, you can see the kittens are not all identical. There's slight variations of the mother. This change is evolution, but it's microevolution because it's just looking at a small short-term effect. And then gene flow actually acts as a counter to evolution, because if you want two things to become different, two different species to evolve from an ancestral species, you have to have their genes be different. Well, if they're interbreeding with each other, then their genes are going to be the same because they're all going to share the same basic DNA. But if you're able to spread those genes into two different areas so that the populations can't reproduce with each other, you'll start seeing them change and become more and more different over time, and eventually they're so different they're considered two different species, and we have the process of speciation. It's how one species becomes two. Gene flow is the counter to that. So let's say you have two populations of birds on either side of a mountain range, and at a certain point of the year they start to reproduce. Well, as long as they don't fly over the mountain range, they'll only reproduce with their own population. They'll start becoming different species. But some of them are going to migrate over and could mate with these over here, and vice versa. That is an example of the genes flowing into different populations. That is the counter to evolution. Because again, if you want things to be different, you have to have the genes be different. You can't breed with each other. So one of the big topics that we cover in evolution is macroevolution. And there's a lot of different things that can be considered in macroevolution, but the general aspect is this is long periods of time that are passing and big changes that are being made through the process of evolution. There are some other topics that we cover in macroevolution. So, example one would be the concept of evolutionary stasis. So people say, like, well, sharks and alligators, for example, their body plan and shape has not changed much in the past 250 million years. As long as there's been sharks, sharks have the same basic body shape. Same thing with alligators. And people wonder, well, if evolution occurs, why do these not change? And that's because the idea is that the traits and features you're given have to be good for the environment that you're in. And if the environment changes, well, then we'll see a change in the shape usually, or the shape or behavior of the organism. But for sharks and alligators, well, there were oceans 250 million years ago, and there are oceans today. The ocean's environment really hasn't changed that much. So the genetics of the shark that led it to its body shape has any deviation from the standard is seen as less fit, so nature selects against it, and it keeps the basic body shape of the shark locked in place. Same thing with the alligators and crocodiles. Millions of years ago there were swamps, and these guys lived in swamps. And today there's still swamps. These guys still live in swamps. Their environment hasn't really changed, so the basic body shape has stayed the same, because any deviation from it is seen as not as advantageous. They're basically perfectly adapted and perfectly designed for life in the ocean or life in swamps. So we don't see much change, and that's evolutionary stasis. Excitation is another term we cover a little bit, and we'll see in zoology, and that's the idea that a feature evolves for one reason but is later on used for something else. A good example is feathers in dinosaurs. Feathers first evolved in dinosaurs not as a means of flight, but as a means to keep babies warm as the earth cooled off in the later part of the Cretaceous period, or just in the Cretaceous period in general. We start seeing feathers evolve for flight later on. That's an example of excitation. They weren't originally designed for flight, but they became useful for flight later on. Mass extinction is another thing we'll cover with long-term changes in evolution. Obviously, that's going to have an effect on the species and life and genetics in general. So obviously that's going to be something that's going to be covered. Adaptive radiation, the idea that one species can evolve slightly into many variations to fill all the niches that are open in a ecosystem. And then also a little bit about coevolution, where the change in evolution in one species actually promotes change in evolution in another species. Usually these two species are closely tied to each other, not necessarily related genetically, but tied to each other. In other words, like for the example, the shape of this flower evolved and changed and became a little bit twisted. The birds that fed on the nectar of this flower, their beaks evolved to be able to fit that flower a little bit better. That's an example of coevolution.